The message came to Earth on a cold morning in December, and it changed everything for the human race forever. Ambassador Celine Vasquez stood in her office at the United Nations headquarters and read the transmission for the 5th time that hour. She could not believe what the aliens were demanding from humanity, and she felt anger building inside her chest like a storm ready to explode. The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and they had never once treated any species as equals. They conquered, they controlled, and they crushed anyone who dared to stand against them. Now they had turned their eyes toward Earth, and they expected humans to simply bow down and accept their fate like every other species before them had done. The war had been short and brutal, lasting only 18 months before humanity's fleet was reduced to scattered remnants hiding in asteroid fields and abandoned stations. 17 colony worlds had fallen to the Concord's forces, and millions of humans now lived under alien occupation. The great powers of the galaxy had united against this young species that had dared to expand beyond its tiny corner of space, and they had won a decisive military victory that left no doubt about who held the power. But the Concord did not simply want victory. They wanted complete submission, and they had summoned humanity's representatives to their capital station to formally surrender. The message made it clear that refusal was not an option, and that the consequences of defiance would be the total destruction of Earth itself. Celine looked out the window at the city below, watching people go about their daily lives without knowing what was about to happen. She wondered how many of them would give up everything rather than live as slaves to alien masters, and she suspected the answer was more than the Concord could possibly imagine. She picked up her phone and made a call to someone very special, someone who had been preparing for this moment ever since the war began. "Admiral Chun," she said quietly. "They've sent the summons? It's time to put our plan into action." 3 weeks later, the human delegation departed from Earth aboard a civilian transport ship that had been painted white to show peaceful intentions. 12 representatives of humanity traveled toward the massive station called the Eternal Throne, where the leaders of the galaxy waited to witness another species bend its knee. Celine stood at the viewport and watched the stars streak past as the ship traveled through hyperspace. Beside her stood her assistant, a quiet woman named Lynn, who rarely spoke but always seemed to be watching everything with sharp, intelligent eyes. The other delegates were diplomats and translators and cultural experts, all chosen carefully for their roles in what was about to unfold. "Are you nervous?" Lynn asked in a soft voice that barely carried above the hum of the engines. "Terrified," Celine admitted with a small smile, but also excited. "We're about to do something that no species has ever done before. And that's worth being a little scared about." Lynn nodded slowly and returned her gaze to the stars, her expression revealing nothing of the thoughts moving behind her dark eyes. The Eternal Throne appeared before them like a metal moon, stretching across space with countless lights glittering along its surface. It was the largest structure humanity had ever seen, built over thousands of years by the combined effort of 100 conquered species. Docking bays opened to receive the tiny human ship, and armed guards in gleaming armor waited to escort the delegation inside. Celine stepped off the ship and looked around at the massive corridor that stretched before her. The walls were lined with holographic displays showing images of every species the Concord had absorbed over the millennia, their histories reduced to brief summaries of conquest and submission. She noticed that a new space had been prepared at the end of the hall, empty and waiting for humanity's image to join the others. "This way," barked the Valith guard, his silver scales catching the light as he gestured with a weapon that hummed with deadly energy. The High Arbiter does not like to be kept waiting. The delegation followed their escorts through corridors that seemed designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Everything was too big, too grand, too overwhelming for beings that stood only 2 meters tall at most. Statues of ancient conquerors loomed overhead, and murals depicted glorious battles where the Concorde had crushed rebellion after rebellion. But Celine walked with her head held high, and her delegates did the same. They would not show fear, not here, not now. They entered a vast chamber where 3 elevated platforms rose above a sunken floor, each one holding representatives of the 3 great powers that ruled the Concorde. The Veilith Hegemony, the Creth Dominion, and the ancient Orwan Collective had gathered to witness humanity's surrender. High Arbiter Thesson Vaur of the Velith rose from his throne and spread his arms wide in a gesture of false welcome. His smile showed too many teeth, and his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a predator watching trapped prey. "Welcome, representatives of Earth," he said in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "We are pleased that you have chosen wisdom over destruction. Your species may yet have a future among the stars." Celine bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement but said nothing. She was observing everything, taking note of the guards positioned around the room, the recording devices floating near the ceiling, the subtle body language of the alien leaders. The Creth delegate Archon Vrilisk clicked his mandibles together in what might have been amusement or contempt. His insectoid body was covered in a hard shell that gleamed like polished obsidian, and his multiple eyes studied the humans with obvious disdain. "Such small creatures," he remarked to his fellow leaders, "and yet they caused us such trouble. I almost admire their foolishness." The Orwan representative did not speak in words. Instead, it communicated through patterns of light that pulsed across its translucent body, and translation devices converted these signals into speech that everyone could understand. It was the oldest of the 3, a being that had existed for centuries, and its thoughts came slowly and deliberately. "Let us proceed," the Orwan flickered. "There is much to discuss and little patience for delay." Thesson Vaur nodded and gestured for the humans to take their seats in the low chairs that had been arranged for them. The seating was clearly designed to make the humans look up at their conquerors, a petty display of dominance that Celine noted with quiet contempt. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap, the picture of calm acceptance. Beside her, Lynn took a seat at the back of the delegation, almost invisible in her plain clothing and unremarkable appearance. The other delegates arranged themselves according to protocol, their faces carefully neutral. "Before we begin," Thesson Vaur announced, "I want you to understand something important. What happens in this chamber today will determine the future of your entire species. Choose your words carefully, Ambassador Vasquez, for they may be the last free words humanity ever speaks." Celine looked up at the towering alien and met his gaze without flinching. "I understand perfectly," she replied in a steady voice, "and I promise you, High Arbiter, we have chosen our words very carefully indeed." Somewhere in the shadows, Lynn smiled. The chamber fell silent as High Arbiter Thesson Vaur lifted a glowing tablet and began to read the terms of surrender that the Galactic Concorde had prepared for humanity. His voice echoed through the vast space like thunder, each word designed to remind the humans of their defeat and their weakness. This was not a negotiation, and everyone in the room knew it. This was a ceremony of submission, a ritual that had been performed countless times over 12,000 years. Article 1, Thesson Vaur announced with obvious satisfaction. The planet Earth and all human colonies shall become a protectorate of the Galactic Concorde, subject to our laws and our authority in all matters of governance and policy. Celine listened without expression, her hands still folded calmly in her lap. Beside her, the other delegates remained equally still, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. Article 2, the High Arbiter continued. Humanity shall immediately dismantle all military vessels exceeding frigate class, and all weapons research facilities shall be placed under Concorde's supervision. Archon Vrilisk made a sound that might have been laughter, his mandibles clicking together in cruel amusement. He had personally led the fleet that destroyed humanity's largest warships, and he seemed to enjoy this reminder of his victory. Article 3. Human expansion shall be permanently limited to a sphere of 12 light years around your home star. Any attempt to colonize beyond this boundary shall be considered an act of war and punished accordingly. The Orowan delegate pulsed with colors that translated as approval. It believed in order above all things, and the idea of containing humanity within strict boundaries appealed to its ancient sense of control. Article 4. Thussenvio read, and now his voice took on a darker tone. A cultural oversight committee appointed by the Concord shall review all human scientific research, entertainment, literature, and educational materials. Content deemed destabilizing or dangerous shall be eliminated. Celine felt anger surge through her at these words, but she kept her expression calm through sheer force of will. They wanted to control not just human bodies, but human minds, to reshape humanity into obedient servants who would never again dream of reaching for the stars. And finally, Article 5. Humanity shall provide an annual labor contribution of 2 million workers for Concord infrastructure projects throughout the galaxy. These workers shall serve terms of no less than 10 years before being permitted to return home. Slavery, Celine thought. They were demanding slaves, dressed up in polite language, but slavery nonetheless. 2 million people taken from their families every year to build monuments to alien power. Thussenvio set down the tablet and smiled down at the human delegation with the confidence of absolute power. These terms are generous, he said, considering the damage your species has caused. Many of my colleagues wanted much harsher punishment, but I convinced them that mercy would serve us better. You should be grateful. Archon Vrilisk leaned forward, his compound eyes gleaming with malice. The Tharuni refused similar terms, he hissed, and their homeworld is now an asteroid field. We erased them from existence so completely that even their history books are gone. Think carefully before you respond, little humans. The Orowan pulsed slowly, its lights forming patterns that translated as cold wisdom. Peace requires sacrifice, it flickered, and this is the natural order of things. The weak must submit so that the strong can maintain stability. Your species is young and does not understand these truths, but you will learn. Celine looked at the tablet containing the terms of surrender, its screen glowing softly in the dim light of the chamber. She thought about Earth, about her family, about every human who had died fighting against impossible odds in a war they were never supposed to win. She picked up the tablet and examined it carefully, as if considering every word and weighing every consequence. The alien leaders watched with patient satisfaction, confident that they knew exactly how this scene would end. Then Celine stood up from her chair. "No," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the chamber. The translation systems processed her word and broadcast it to every being in the room. And for a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. It was as if time itself had frozen in shock. "I am sorry," Thussenvio said slowly, certain that he had misheard or that the translators had made an error. "Could you repeat that?" Celine's delegation rose from their seats and stood behind her in a unified line, their faces calm and determined. "I said no," Celine repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "These terms are unacceptable, and we reject them entirely. Humanity will not submit to slavery. Not today. Not ever." She placed the tablet on the table with a soft click that seemed to echo through the chamber like an explosion. "We are leaving," she announced, and she turned toward the exit without looking back. The Concord leaders sat frozen in their elevated thrones, unable to process what was happening. In 12,000 years of galactic history, no species had ever simply refused their terms and walked away. It was unthinkable, impossible, against every law of survival that governed the universe. Archon Vrilisk recovered first, his body surging upward as his wings unfurled in a display of threat and fury. "You cannot do this," he shrieked, his voice rising to a pitch that hurt human ears. "You have lost. Your fleet is destroyed, your colonies burn, and your planet lies defenseless. You have no leverage, no power, nothing." Celine paused at the door and turned to face the enraged alien. And for the first time since entering the chamber, she smiled. "We have one thing you do not understand," she said calmly. "We are not afraid to lose everything." Thesson Vazir rose from his throne, his silver scales rippling with colors that indicated deep disturbance and confusion. "Ambassador, please," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Let us be rational about this. If you reject these terms, we will have no choice but to resume hostilities. Your species will be completely and utterly exterminated." Celine finished for him. "Yes, maybe you are right. Maybe you will destroy us completely and wipe humanity from the universe. But it will not be quiet, and it will not be cheap." The quiet woman at the back of the delegation stepped forward, and something about her presence commanded attention despite her unremarkable appearance. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small data chip that gleamed silver in the light. She tossed it onto the table, where it landed with a sound that somehow seemed louder than it should have been. "Before you resume your war," she said in a voice like cold steel, "I suggest you review the contents of that chip." Thesson Var stared at her, really looking at her for the first time. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman straightened her shoulders and met his gaze without fear. "I am Admiral Chen Wei-Lin," she announced, "decorated war hero and strategic architect of humanity's resistance. I have been standing among this delegation the entire time, and none of your famous intelligence networks noticed." She smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "That should tell you something about what else you might have missed." The chamber exploded into chaos as guards rushed forward and the Concord leaders shouted commands. But the humans stood their ground, calm in the center of the storm. And somewhere deep in space, 17 hidden devices waited silently for the signal that would change everything. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin stood in the center of the chaos with her arms crossed and a calm expression on her face. Guards surrounded the human delegation with weapons drawn, and the Concord leaders screamed orders from their elevated platforms. "Seize them," Archon Vrillis commanded, his mandibles clicking with rage. "Take them to the detention cells immediately." The Thesson Var raised his hand to stop the guards, his silver eyes fixed on the small data chip lying on the table. "Wait," he ordered, and something in his voice made everyone freeze in place. "Let us see what the Admiral has brought us before we act rashly." He gestured to a technician who hurried forward and inserted the chip into a holographic display system. Immediately, the chamber filled with floating images and coordinates that made the alien leaders go very still. "These are the locations of 17 Nova-class antimatter devices," Chun explained in a voice that carried no emotion. "We positioned them throughout Concord space during the past 4 months while you were busy celebrating your victory." The holographic display showed 17 points of light scattered across a map of the galaxy, each one marking a position near critical Concord infrastructure. There were devices near military shipyards, near communication hubs, near population centers that house billions of beings. One of these devices is currently orbiting your agricultural world of Theseus 4. Chun continued, and that single planet produces 60% of the food supply for the entire Valeth hegemony. If that device detonates, your people will face famine within months. Thesson Var stared at the map with eyes that had grown wide with something he had not felt in centuries: fear. "You are bluffing," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "We are human," Chun replied flatly, "and we do not bluff about mutually assured destruction. In fact, we invented the concept." The Arwen delegates' bioluminescent patterns had gone completely dark, which the translators struggled to interpret. Finally, the ancient being flickered back to life with colors that indicated deep shock and confusion. "This is madness," it pulsed. "You would destroy yourselves and take billions of innocents with you. No rational species would make such a threat." Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward to stand beside Admiral Chun, and her smile had turned sharp and dangerous. "That is exactly the point," she said. "You have conquered species for 12,000 years because they were rational. They looked at the odds. They calculated their chances of survival. And they submitted when the math told them they could not win." She swept her arm toward the holographic display with its 17 points of deadly light. "We do not do math," she declared. "We do spite." Archon Vrilisk made a sound that might have been nervous laughter, but his compound eyes kept darting toward the map and the device that floated near his species' breeding grounds. "You would not dare," he hissed. "Your own people would die in the retaliation." "Yes," Chun agreed simply. "They would. Billions of humans would die, and perhaps our species would be wiped out entirely. But before that happened, we would take a significant portion of your civilization with us." She pulled up more data on the holographic display, showing the estimated casualties and infrastructure damage if all 17 devices detonated simultaneously. "3 of your major shipyards gone," she listed calmly. "The communication hub that connects the core worlds would be vaporized. 4 agricultural planets would become uninhabitable. And approximately 2 billion Concord citizens would die in the initial blasts alone." The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence, and the chamber had fallen into absolute silence. "The follow-on effects would be even worse," Chun continued. "Supply chains would collapse. Populations would starve, and the political instability could tear the Concord apart from within. Your empire has enemies who have been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity." Thiessen sat down heavily on his throne, his scales having turned a pale color that indicated extreme distress. He had faced many challenges during his long career, but nothing had prepared him for an enemy that embraced mutual destruction. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this? What could possibly be worth such a price?" Vasquez walked slowly toward the elevated platforms, ignoring the guards who tensed but did not stop her. "Freedom," she said simply. "Dignity. The right to choose our own fate instead of having it chosen for us. These things are worth dying for, and they are worth taking others with us if that is what it takes." She stopped at the base of Thiessen platform and looked up at him without fear. "Your problem is that you have never faced a species like us before. Everyone else surrendered because survival was their highest priority, and you assumed we would be the same. But we come from a planet where people have burned themselves alive rather than submit to tyrants, where soldiers have charged into certain death to buy time for their comrades, where entire nations have chosen destruction over occupation." The ruin flickered with colors that requested more information, and Vasquez obliged. "In our history, there was a city called Masada, where 1,000 people chose suicide rather than become slaves. There was a battle called Thermopylae, where 300 warriors held a pass against an army of millions. There was a war called World War II, where our people chose to keep fighting even when all logical hope was lost." She turned to address all 3 of the Concord leaders at once. "We have a phrase that every human child learns," she said. "Give me liberty or give me death." It is not just words to us. It is who we are. Chun stepped forward with additional data on her display. "We knew from the beginning that we could not win a conventional war against your forces," she explained, "so we never planned to fight one. Instead, we hid our true capabilities, scattered our assets, and prepared for the moment when you would demand our surrender." She highlighted certain points on the map. "It took 4 months of careful work while your attention was focused on our visible fleet. We used civilian ships, fake transponder codes, and volunteers who knew they might never return home. The devices were built in secret facilities that your intelligence never discovered. using materials we acquired through channels you never monitored. Archon Vrilisk buzzed with something that sounded like grudging respect mixed with horror. You planned this from the beginning, he realized. The war, the defeats. Everything was part of a larger strategy. Not everything, Chun admitted. We lost many battles we truly tried to win, and millions of our people died in real combat. But yes, even as we fought, we were also preparing for this moment. We knew that eventually you would offer us terms of surrender, and we knew that we would need leverage when that time came. Thisenvaya raised his head and looked at the two human women with new eyes. He was seeing them clearly for the first time, not as representatives of a defeated species, but as something far more dangerous. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Vasquez smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Now we can finally begin a real negotiation. The Galactic Concord called an emergency session that lasted for 3 days, and the leaders of 100 worlds gathered to discuss something that had never happened before in their long history. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years now sat together in uneasy silence, united by the terrifying realization that humanity had changed the rules of galactic politics forever. The old certainties no longer applied, and nobody knew what would happen next. Intelligence teams scrambled across the galaxy, searching for the 17 antimatter devices that the humans claimed to have positioned near critical infrastructure. Within the first 48 hours, they found 7 of them exactly where Admiral Chun had said they would be. The existence of those 7 confirmed the likely existence of the other 10, and that was enough to make every leader in the Concord very nervous. Thisenvaya stood before the emergency assembly and delivered a report that shook the foundations of galactic civilization. "We have verified that the human threat is real," he announced, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "They have somehow positioned weapons of mass destruction throughout our territory without our knowledge or detection." The chamber erupted in angry shouting as representatives accused each other of failure and demanded explanations. How had these primitive newcomers outsmarted an empire that had dominated the stars for 12 millennia? The question now, Thisenvaya continued over the noise, is what we do about it. We cannot simply destroy Earth as we planned, because doing so would trigger the detonation of all 17 devices. Archon Vrilisk clicked his mandibles in frustration. "Then we negotiate," he hissed. "We pretend to give them what they want while our agents locate and disable the remaining devices. Once the threat is neutralized, we crush them." But the Orwan delegate pulsed with colors that indicated disagreement. "That will not work," it flickered. "The humans have surely anticipated such a strategy. They will have deadman switches, automated triggers, backup plans we cannot predict." The ancient being's lights dimmed with something that might have been sadness. "I have studied their history in the days since this crisis began," it continued, "and I have come to a disturbing conclusion. They are not bluffing, and they cannot be tricked. Their species has a long tradition of choosing death over submission. Meanwhile, news of humanity's defiance spread across the galaxy through unofficial channels and secret communications that the Concord could not control. On occupied worlds where other species lived under Concord rule, beings whispered to each other in the darkness. "The humans refused," they said, and those 3 words carried more power than any weapon. The Thon, who had surrendered after only 1 week of war, heard the news and felt shame burning in their hearts. They had given up so quickly, and now they saw that another path had always been possible. The Meridani, whose culture had been reshaped and corrected by Concord oversight committees, listened to reports of human stubbornness and remembered what their ancestors had been like before submission. The Vul, who had once been warriors but had been forced to forget their martial traditions, felt something stirring deep in their racial memory. The old fire was not completely dead after all. The humans refused. The whispers spread, and the Concorde does not know what to do. On the Eternal Throne Station, a new negotiation session began with very different seating arrangements. There were no more elevated platforms or sunken floors, no more psychological tricks designed to make the humans feel small. This time, the chairs were all the same height. High Arbiter Thyssen Var faced Ambassador Vasquez across a plain table, and for the first time, they spoke as equals. "You are insane," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only bewilderment. "You would destroy yourselves and take billions of innocent beings with you, rather than accept protectorate status. No rational species would make such a choice." Vasquez nodded calmly, accepting the characterization without offense. "Our history is full of people who chose death over chains," she replied. "It is not insanity to us. It is identity. We have fought against impossible odds so many times that it has become part of who we are." She pulled up a holographic display showing images from human history, and the alien leaders watched in fascination and horror. "This is Thermopylae," she explained, pointing to ancient warriors facing a vast army. 300 soldiers against 1,000,000, and they knew they would die. They fought anyway, and their sacrifice gave others time to organize resistance. The image changed to show a burning city. "This is Warsaw," she continued, "where people with almost no weapons rose up against a military force that had conquered half a continent. They knew they could not win, but they fought because surrender was unthinkable." More images followed. Masada, the Alamo, Stalingrad, Vietnam, places where humans had chosen defiance over survival. "We have been fighting wars against impossible odds since before we learned to write," Vasquez said quietly. "Sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose. But we always make it cost more than it was worth." Admiral Chun stepped forward with additional data. "Your empire has conquered species for 12,000 years because they calculated the odds and submitted when the math said they could not win," she explained. "That strategy works perfectly against rational beings, who prioritize survival above all else." She met Thyssen Var's eyes without flinching. "It does not work against us because we are not purely rational. We have emotions that override our logic, values that we place above survival. Pride that will not let us kneel even when kneeling is the smart choice." The Uruan delegate flickered with a question that had been troubling it since this crisis began. "What do you actually want?" it asked. "What would satisfy you?" Vasquez smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in her expression. "Equality," she answered. "We want a seat at the table, the same as any other member of the Concorde. We do not want to conquer you or destroy your civilization. We just want to be treated as equals rather than as servants." Archimbrisk scoffed at this demand. "Impossible," he hissed. "You have existed for the blink of an eye. You have achieved nothing compared to the great powers. What have you done to earn a seat among us?" Vasquez looked at him with an expression of mild amusement. "We have achieved something that no other species in your history has ever managed," she replied calmly. "We said no." The words hung in the air, simple and undeniable. "Every other species you conquered submitted when faced with overwhelming force," Vasquez continued. "Every single one, for 12,000 years. But we refused, and here we are, negotiating as equals instead of signing surrender documents." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "That is our achievement, and it is unprecedented in the history of your galaxy. That should count for something." Thyssen Var sat back in his chair and considered the human woman before him with new understanding. She was right, and he knew it. Humanity had done something truly remarkable, something that challenged everything the Concorde believed about power and submission. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "perhaps we have been thinking about this situation incorrectly." And for the first time since the crisis began, there was hope in the room. The negotiations that followed lasted for 4 long months, and they were the most difficult diplomatic talks in the history of the Galactic Concorde. Every day brought new challenges and new conflicts as the Concord leaders tried to find ways to maintain their authority while the humans refused to accept anything less than full equality. There were shouting matches, walkouts, and moments when it seemed like the entire process would collapse. HFY discovered that negotiating with humans was like nothing he had ever experienced before. They were stubborn beyond reason, creative in their arguments, and absolutely unwilling to compromise on their core demands. "You cannot expect us to simply grant you membership status," he argued during one particularly heated session. "There are procedures, evaluations, centuries of tradition." Admiral Chun smiled that dangerous smile that he had come to know so well. "We do not care about your traditions," she replied calmly, "and we are not asking for membership. We are demanding it. The alternative is destruction for both our species. So I suggest you find a way to make it work." The Concord tried every tactic they knew to break the human resolve. They offered bribes of technology and territory. They made subtle threats about the consequences of continued defiance, and they attempted to divide the human delegation through private negotiations. Nothing worked. There were assassination attempts as well. 3 against Chun and 2 against Vasquez, all of them failures. The humans had been expecting such measures and had prepared accordingly. After the 3rd attempt on Chun's life, she sent a message to the Concord leadership that made them abandon that particular strategy. For every assassination attempt, her message read, "We will reveal the location of one more hidden device to the general public. Let us see how your citizens react when they learn exactly how close they are to annihilation." The attempt stopped immediately. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening across the galaxy. Other species were beginning to stir. The Thon, who had lived as subjects for 3,000 years, began organizing secret resistance cells for the first time in their history. Human advisors, quietly deployed through back channels, helped them develop strategies for passive resistance and civil disobedience. The Maridani found copies of their forbidden literature circulating through underground networks. Human scholars had somehow obtained these texts and translated them into modern languages that young Maridani could read. Cultural memories that the Concord had tried to erase were coming back to life. The Vul received technical specifications for weapon systems that had been banned under their surrender terms. No one could prove where these documents came from, but everyone knew. The Concord leadership faced a nightmare scenario. Humanity was not just refusing to submit. They were actively undermining Concord control over other subject species. "This must stop," Archimbrilis demanded during one session. "Your people are spreading sedition throughout our territory." Vasquez looked at him with an expression of innocent confusion. "I have no idea what you are talking about," she said sweetly. "We are a small, defeated species with no resources or influence. How could we possibly be doing any of the things you describe?" Everyone in the room knew she was lying, but no one could prove it. Finally, after months of brutal negotiation, the mathematics changed in humanity's favor. The cost of subjugating humanity had risen too high. The 17 devices were only the beginning of the problem, and the growing unrest among subject species threatened to destabilize the entire galactic order. Continuing the conflict would mean years of guerrilla warfare, economic disruption, and political instability. On the 1-year anniversary of humanity's walkout from the original surrender negotiations, a ceremony was held in the Grand Chamber of the Eternal Throne. Ambassador Celine Vasquez stood before the assembled representatives of 100 worlds and pressed humanity's sigil into the Great Codex, the ancient book that recorded the names of every member species of the Galactic Concord. Humanity was now a full and equal member of the galactic community, the first species to earn that status through defiance rather than submission. The chamber was filled with beings of every shape and size, watching in silence as history was made. Some watched with anger, some with fear, and some with barely concealed hope. After the ceremony, the Oruan delegate approached Vasquez in a quiet corner of the station. Its bioluminescent patterns flickered with complex emotions that were difficult to translate. "You have changed something fundamental," it said slowly. "The order that held for 12,000 years is beginning to fracture. Other species now believe that they can resist. That submission is not the only option." Vasquez looked at the ancient being with curiosity. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "No," the Oruan replied, and its light shifted to colors that indicated something like respect. "It is an observation, and perhaps even gratitude. We had forgotten what it was like to face a species that would rather burn than kneel." The alien paused, its patterns dimming thoughtfully. "It is clarifying," it concluded, "to be reminded that there are beings in the universe who value some things more than survival." Vasquez nodded slowly, considering the Oruan's words. "We have another saying," she offered. "Those who would give up essential liberty for a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." A man named Benjamin Franklin wrote that a long time ago. "Your people speak in many such phrases," the Oruan observed. "We have had a lot of practice," Vasquez smiled. "We have been arguing with tyrants since our species first learned to talk." She looked out at the vast chamber, at the hundreds of representatives from species that had lived under Concord rule for millennia. Some of them were already looking at the humans with new expressions that held questions and possibilities. "And we are not done yet," she added quietly. Admiral Chun joined her at the viewport, looking out at the stars that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Do you think they understand what happened here?" Chun asked. "Some of them do," Vasquez replied. "The Oruan understands, and I think Thiesenvier is beginning to. The others will learn eventually. And the subject species," Chun pressed. "The ones who are starting to wake up," Vasquez smiled, and her eyes gleamed with plans that stretched far into the future. "They are learning too," she said, "and once they truly understand what we have shown them, the galaxy will never be the same." Far away on occupied worlds across the Concord, beings of 100 species repeated the words that had become a rallying cry. The humans refused, they whispered, and they won. And in their hearts, they began to believe that they could refuse too. The stars were changing, and humanity had lit the spark that would set the galaxy ablaze with the fire of freedom. This was not an ending. It was just the beginning.